Good morning, my dear brothers and sisters. I have to communicate my reflection through this recording because of the difficulty at the moment I have in not being able to travel by plane. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you reflection centered around the theme, the experience of the Synod, and the title that I have chosen together with the organizers is Vocational Youth Ministry, Discernment and Spiritual Accompaniment. And as a subtitle, I added Renewing and Strengthening Our Commitment in Accompanying the Young. We have heard the first conference of Father Rossano Sala, and that conference has given us a clear panorama of the situation of the young as portrayed within the Instrumentum Laboris. As we know, the latter document is a very faithful and clear picture that comes out of the various sources and experiences that we have lived in these last years. What follows now is a continuation by focusing on the challenges and the processes that as a church we need to take seriously in our ministry of accompaniment and discernment. You see that the conference, the reflection I am going to share with you, first and foremost, I am going to start by pointing to three little key elements that will help us to approach the situations of the young. The conference by Father Rossano Sala has given us a big, large panorama of the challenges. And that conference is the foundation of what I'm going to share. In the beginning of my reflection, I would like to recall three elements that will help us better approach the ministry of accompaniment and discernment. Then we will enter into the issue of vocation in relation to the call for universal joy. And then we'll move on. Our understanding of vocation, our understanding of discernment, and our commitment of accompaniment. Finishing the last point on the qualities of the mentors. In these various points, the idea is to study the Instrumentum Laboris from what we have received from the various sources, the online questionnaire, the International Congress, the pre-Synod meeting together with 15,000 participants online, because while studying the Instrumentum Laboris, we have all that we need to recognize to strengthen our youth ministry with an explicit vocational approach, with an explicit vocational perspective. So the first point I would like to start with is the story of the young. And I'm going to present simply 3 points. I would like to call them keys that will help us position ourselves in the story of our young people. And the first one is young people's approach to reality. How is their way of interpreting, recognizing reality in relation to the way we adopt in recognizing and interpreting the same? We are living in a world where the basic format and mode of communication is undergoing a change. Unless we are ready to be humble enough to incarnate ourselves in the story of the young, we risk becoming invisible strangers among inquisitive natives. And this is the first point that I would like to invite you to reflect on. If we are journeying with the young, are we entering their story? Are we ready to listen to the way they are interpreting reality? Instrumentum Laboris number 26 points out this challenge. Young generations are the bearers of a particular approach to reality that is an asset and the source of originality. However, it can also be disconcerting or perplexing to others. We need to avoid hasty judgments. The approach of young people is based on priority of concreteness and action over theoretical analysis. Things are understood by doing, and problems are solved as they arise. We are faced with the pluralism of differences. And the question I would like to share with you, my dear brothers and sisters, is this. In front of this first challenge in the ministry of accompaniment the young, we ask ourselves, how ready are we not only to be part of their story, but above all, to be familiar with their language, their metaphors, their paradigms, and their imagination. The second point, spirituality and religiosity. Another trait which, as ministers to the young, we need to be familiar with is the distinction that young people are making between spirituality and religiosity. For many of us, we have grown in a culture where there is a complete fusion and identity between the spiritual and the religious experience. It is not so for our young people today. Instrumentum Laboris 29 touches on this very essential challenge. Variety is what describes best young people's relationship with faith and religious practice. Generally speaking, they declare themselves open to spirituality, although the sacred is often quite separate from their daily lives. Many believe that religion is a private matter, and they see themselves as spiritual but not religious. My dear friends, this awareness has huge implications in the processes of discernment with our young people. We are called to detect the seeds of spirituality in their lives with the hidden potential it contains. Attention needs to be given to the fact that what frequently hinders the journey of the young in discovering the truth about Jesus, in discovering a religious experience, is both the false image that is portrayed about Jesus, together with the unpreparedness of pastors to be in tune with this generation. And we know that at times we meet young people who give us the message that they are not religious, but they are spiritually grounded, spiritually very deep. The third key to enter and understand the story of our young people, the digital continent. We can say that the air young people breathe is digital. Being this an undisputed starting point, we are called to recognize it, avoiding the danger of, on one side, looking only at the potential of it and being carried along with it, or on the other side, we simply rejected out of ignorance or inadequate formation. In this light, we recognize the challenges that are generated and on which we dwelt in the first intervention that Father Rossano gave us. The way young people understand reality, spirituality and religiosity, and the digital continent. I just wanted to touch on these first, in the first point, on these three elements that can somehow accompany us on the following point. The second point I would like to share with you is precisely the first part of the first chapter of the second part of Instrumentum Laboris. How are we looking at this reality in the light of the Word of God? If youth is a very promising phase in life of the human person with its difficulties and challenges, not just a contemporary condition, for this very reason, their experience becomes the human space where great things can potentially take place. This is not only to be recognized on the level of nature, but on the level of grace. And one of the things, those of you who have studied well the Instrumentum Laboris, is this attention, especially in part 2, to recognize the spiritual and the human, the aspect of grace, the aspect of nature, the human element and the transcendental element, the theological element and the anthropological aspect. And definitely, as we will see while we are going through this conference, this reflection, we will see how there is a blending, there is a coming together of the spiritual and the human in these processes. I would like to the first point of the second section. The part 2 of Instrumentum Laboris speaks about the universal call for joy. And it's interesting how discernment and accompaniment have to be met, have to be understood, have to be discovered and deepened within the bigger picture. The bigger picture where fundamentally there is a universal call for joy. And what is interesting is that Instrumentum Laboris presents several stories. In the light of the Word of God, how is this universal call for joy being explained? How is it lived out? And what I did in this paper is I tried to put these stories together into 3 groups. And the first group is the story of Joshua and Jeremiah. In the story of our young people, we can recognize the energy of Joshua as much as the resistance of Jeremiah. Joshua is called to be strong and courageous, both by Moses and by God. While Jeremiah is on a different level, his story is marked by uncertainty, fear, and hope. How can a young person be a prophet of hope in a world where corruption and injustice hold sway? We can hear it said by Jeremiah. The Instrumentum Laboris is offering us 2 models of how strength and fear have to be dealt with within this universal call for joy. And the reflection I would like to share is the following. The church, in encountering the Joshuas of today, is called to renew her enthusiasm in embracing the risk of faith, avoiding false worldly securities. On the other hand, today's Jeremiahs are eagerly waiting for the church to help them overcome their fear and communicate in word and in deed, "Do not be afraid, for I am with you and I will rescue you." We know in our ministry that we are still encountering young people who somehow, within their lives, they project this desire of Joshua, but also this difficulty, uncertainty, fear, and lack of hope of Jeremiah. The second group of stories, it's the parable of the prodigal son, but also the experience of Samuel. We can say that on one side we have mercy and accompaniment. In this group of stories, we have 2 stories and 2 epochs, 2 different ages, yet we have the same desire. We can connect with the experience of mercy abundantly communicated by the father of the prodigal son and his elder brother, as much as with the willingness of Samuel to listen and to be accompanied. The two sons, the two brothers of the same merciful fathers. What is this story saying to us today? If not that this parable depicts in a very clear way that the commitment towards a ministry of mercy can only come from adult figures who are able to recognize without judging, interpret in the light of faith, and help the young to choose. The universal call for joy passes through the experience, the presence, example, and commitment of adult figures. Yet it also passes through the presence of adults who are able to meet the Samuels of today. In a complementary manner, we can discover how the experience of Samuel enriches the meaning of the icon of the merciful Father. It communicates the need to promote a space for listening. The presence of Eli, another adult, who slowly himself recognizes God's voice in the life of the young man. And Eli himself is discovering a discerning presence, therefore his openness to this presence. Two stories, my dear friends, are an invitation for us today to make sure that all young people that we encounter on our path, that the church encounters on its path, can experience the same fatherly and motherly attitudes. Young people need accompaniment not as an optional element in the task of educating and evangelizing the young, but as an ecclesial duty and the right that every young person has in being accompanied. The third group of stories, we have Solomon, Esther, and the rich young man. And we see here three stories. On one side there is wisdom, the desire to be accompanied, but on the other side there is also the refusal of a life plan. Embracing the journey of faith is a life-changing experience. And we can see it in the story of King Solomon. Understanding heart is what he asked, as much as in the story of Queen Esther, accompanied and supported by her people. But yet, we also have the story of the rich young man who simply refuses to be accompanied. And here I would like to quote from Instrumentum Laboris 84. Jesus empowers the young man to move from a loss of direction or to configure his entire life. Jesus asked the young man to embrace risk, to lose what has already acquired, to trust, and to step into the mindset of faith. We move now to the third point. The third, fourth, and fifth, I would like to treat them together. Because if up to now we have seen what keys do we need to understand young people, their approach to reality, spirituality and religion, and the digital world, if we need to understand the story of our young people in the light of the Word of God, Joshua and Jeremiah, the prodigal son and Eli, Solomon, Esther, and the rich young man, now we move to our own ministry. How are we allowing ourselves to be guided and enlightened? And the fourth point is this: what is the understanding that we have of the term vocation? And the 3 points I present there are the 3 points that Instrumentum Laboris is inviting us to deepen. And the first one is this: the theology of vocation. Vocation is not an act by any one of us. Vocation is a call by God. It is a word said by God, expressed by God in the life of our young people. And yet, the risk is always present that while speaking about vocation, we convey, knowingly or unknowingly, a message that is mainly, if not solely, focused on consecrated and priestly vocations. My dear brothers, the understanding of the term vocation needs to be nurtured first and foremost by discovering the theology of vocation. Once this understanding is clearly and convincingly embraced on a personal level, theology of vocation, it's God's call, God's project for each and every one of us, then it will become a source that enlightens our pastoral vision and guides our processes. Our baptismal call is the place where every vocational path is rooted. It is within the experience of this divine filiation that we accept to follow Jesus, which basically means that in our ministry, in our pastoral processes, we help our young people to discover being sons and daughters of Jesus, and within that relationship discover their own call. But if vocation is a theological experience, it is a theological experience rooted in the human experience. So if there is the theological aspect of vocation, there is also the human, the anthropological aspect. Theology of vocation goes hand in hand with an anthropological understanding of vocation. The anthropology of vocation is intimately linked to the theology of vocation in the sense that the human desire is projected to reach truth and fullness to the level of transcendence. So you understand why the previous point, the universal call for joy, is the background which helps us to discover the beauty of God's project for each and every one of our young people. In view of truly holistic vocational youth ministry, we need to be careful about the subtle challenges that can easily be overlooked if we only apply a restricted understanding of vocation. And in Instrumentum Laboris 89, this is said in a very synthetic way, talking about life as a vocation. Life as a vocation allows us to highlight some elements that are very important for the growth of a young person. Ruling out the possibility that life is determined by faith, and also that it is a private good that can be managed on our own. Life is a gift where God is enlightening our young people to discover His project for each and every one of them. If vocation, therefore, has a theological and anthropological dimension, this is done within an ecclesial landscape. Thus, the important task that lays ahead of us is that of underlining that particular calls can be understood only within the vocational landscape of the entire church. And here, it's very subtle what the Instrumentum Laboris is suggesting to us, because this is coming from what young people have been expressing. This ecclesial vision, holistic but also missionary, will help us to envision our vocation animation ministry not as a parallel path to youth ministry, but rather as the soul of youth ministry, vocational youth ministry. And I firmly believe that here we are, this synod will give us a huge opportunity to ask ourselves whether the pastoral proposals that we are offering to the young are simply moments which they consume, or are they spaces where experiences are lived, not only in view of the present, but rather in view of a present that holds the key to the future. So we have seen the understanding of vocation. Now I would like to move to 2 points: discernment and accompaniment. Now I make a statement in beginning of number 4, which I firmly believe in. The theme of discernment is one that will necessarily accompany us in the future once we take vocational youth ministry seriously. And I firmly believe that this is where the future is going to have a very important say on what we are doing. The future is going to benefit from our understanding of discernment and accompaniment that we need and we are called to deepen today. I would like to simply point here the essential points presented by Instrumentum Laboris. First and foremost, young people are looking for discernment. For the young themselves, the very term discernment is not familiar. However, they feel that they want to walk the journey that it entails, even if they cannot name it. This leads us to the fact that young believers and non-believers are looking for help. They are in search of adults who are able to help them face and decipher the challenges that come their way. And we, as ministers, need to be convinced of this. If the young people are looking for discernment, we need to be clear what is discernment about. What does it consist of? And here the Instrumentum Laboris recalls Evangelii Gaudium number 51, which represents Pope in that exhortation, apostolic exhortation. He highlights, and it's the methodology that we are being faced with, that we are employing in the Synod as well. Recognizing, interpreting, and choosing. And Instrumentum Laboris in 113, number 113, explains the three. Recognizing means giving a name. What is emerging in one's own life? Life experience, being ambiguous, needs to be interpreted. And on the basis of interpretations, choices need to be made. This is all easier said than done, as we say. Therefore, the need for formation, the need to get ourselves prepared. And this is the challenge that is on our shoulders. The desire to be formed in the whole area of affectivity, intelligence, and style. Discernment, not being a job, neither a privilege, is a call for humble listening, a prayerful heart that is not led by fear or personal interest. In discernment, definitely, the role of conscience, the formation of conscience. And here again, the Instrumentum Laboris treats the term, the subject, the experience of conscience in the same way that it treats the vocation understanding. Conscience from a spiritual point of view, but also conscience from a human point of view. The formation of conscience is first and foremost from the perspective of faith that needs to be understood. It is a testimony that the central role that conscience plays in the process of discernment. In youth ministry, the formation of conscience together with education to freedom are a must to help discover and understand the wider horizons that vocational discernment demands from each person. I would like now to move discernment. Young people are looking for it. Recognize, interpret, and choose, and the role of conscience, to the art of accompaniment, the fifth point in my conference. And again, here I repeat what Instrumentum Laboris is insisting on. Young people are asking to be accompanied. And allow me, my dear brothers and sisters, to encourage you to listen to the desire of our young people to be accompanied. We need to get in tune with the language that they have, which is different from our language. You understand the three main points that I started with. Their language of saying what they want is different from the language that we adopted when we were their age of the same demands. We asked for discernment in a different way than what young people are asking for today. As is in the case with discernment, the same is reported regarding the art of accompaniment. Both in the pre-synodal meeting as well as from various bishops' conferences, young people are expressing this need repeatedly, underlining in particular the importance of the testimony and humanity of their mentors. Accompaniment, in line with discernment and intimately connected to it, has a vocational objective. Here comes the importance, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, of being formed as ministers with a solid theology and a solid anthropology of vocation. Vocation from a theological perspective, vocation from an anthropological perspective. The same with the theme of conscience, educating conscience towards freedom. How do we actually capture what young people are asking? And above all, how do we go about discovering and helping them to discover their call within an experience of a free and enlightened conscience? The second area of accompaniment is unearthing the treasure and synergy with human sciences. And again, here in the Instrumentum Laboris, I believe we have some very interesting reflections, very deep reflections that it is good to keep in our understanding even when the synod is over. Accompaniment does not have a rigid protocol. It takes on many different direct and indirect forms. The first point in unearthing, first and foremost, let us discover the richness of the tradition that speaks about spiritual fatherhood and motherhood. We in the Catholic tradition, we have a huge tradition, very rich, both in the experiences, reflection, and above all in literature. Let us get familiar with the journey of a church which has always accompanied its sons and daughters. The second one, and this is very pertinent because Pope Francis is frequently returning on this point that I'm going to explain now, is the need to differentiate between accompaniment and other forms of personal accompaniment, such as counseling, coaching, mentoring, and tutoring. Differentiation does not mean separation. In fact, Instrumentum Laboris 1-5 says it very clearly. A careful pedagogy will allow for the integration of the psychological dimension into spiritual accompaniment. Not just listening and empathy, but also discernment and interacting with the Word. Not just trust, but also struggling to realize that the joy of the gospel reawakens the loftiness of our desires. Not just dreams, but actual steps through life's difficulty. And the same thing about the sacrament of reconciliation. Despite their closeness, ministers of reconciliation and spiritual mentors have different purposes, methods, and languages. So in this section, we have seen the clear understanding of vocation, theological, anthropological. We have seen the art of discernment and the art of accompaniment. I come to the last point. And the last point treats the qualities of the mentors. Now here, it's very interesting because what Instrumentum Laboris presents is what young people have shared. And briefly, the responses from the various sources are presented in Instrumentum Laboris number 130 to 133. Give us a very clear picture of what kind of mentor young people are looking for. And the points that I present in my paper are the ones that Instrumentum Laboris offers, and they are very much in line with the whole literature in this area. First and foremost, mentors are called to respect the mystery that all persons carry in themselves and trust that the Lord, who is already at work in them, will continue to work in them. The first point, therefore, is that mentors are to respect the mystery, but they respect the mystery in the manner that they themselves are bearers of the mystery. The second quality, they are invited to realize that they are a model that they can influence. Their way of being and doing, their example is not irrelevant in the journey of spiritual and personal accompaniment. The third point is the deep affective interaction that is created in spiritual accompaniment needs a sound formation on the part of mentors. Mentors need to be willing, first and foremost, to work on themselves. The fourth point, they are called to be good listeners, true servants, endowed with the gift of discernment. It is not what they think, it is not what they want, it is what God has in store for the person concerned. Finally, the young are reminding their mentors to avoid leading them on the way of passive participation. Accompaniment is about favoring growth, educating towards freedom, giving space and empowerment. My dear brothers and sisters, I would like to conclude by just recalling two challenges. And the first one is this: as educators for and with the young, we are called to engage in the art of listening, to form ourselves to become good listeners. Young people, for them, listening is not an act, but an attitude of the heart. To listen to their expectation regarding the church. They want a church which is simple and evangelically very challenging. We are asked by our young people to help generate a renewed ecclesial approach, a less institutional, a more relational. The second challenge. I would like to invite you, my dear brothers and sisters, to reflect and contemplate the theme of holiness. We should not be afraid. We should not be ashamed about this treasure. Before we can suggest it to young people, we are called to experience it as witnesses, thus becoming a likable community. Here lies the roots of gift of discernment with the journey of contemplation. In this dynamic, the young are helped to find their call, their vocation. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all.